Hi, everybody. Is the mic on? Yeah, can you hear me? They always say in the beginning, feel the room. So how do you feel? Are you good? Not too hot in here? Enough air to breathe? So welcome, everybody. I'm Stefan Weichert. I'm with the non-profit VOCER from Hamburg, Germany, and its Institute for Digital Resilience that currently builds up a new database and platform for non-profit news called NPJ.news. And I have 4 panel guests. They said in the beginning it should be only 3, but they allowed us to have 4 here because all of them are very important people. I'd like to introduce to you, to my right, Elisa Semanke from Berlin. She's the co-founder and editorial director of Investigate Europe, and which is a cross-border team and European cooperative of investigative journalists from 11 countries. Julia Werneson here, also from Berlin. She's the managing director of Hostwriter, a global network of journalists, and she's also the director of the publishing platform Unbiased the News that also has played a role on one of these panels, I think yesterday. Far right, there's Aaron Pilhofer. He's a professor for journalism innovation at Temple University in Philadelphia. And before that, he was the interim chief digital officer at The Guardian in London. And we learned to know each other in New York at the New York Times, where he was before. Also editor for digital strategy and editor of interactive news. And on the far right, there's Samir Parania. He is a director of Macroscope, which is a consultancy company focused on non-profit projects, I would say. Or maybe you can explain a little later. And he's also the co-founder of the Charitable Journalism Project in the UK. So thanks for coming, for the 4 of you. So why are we here? We are all here because we are fascinated about the non-profit sector, especially in journalism. And because we care so much about our democratic system as such. We strongly believe that non-profit media can enhance a more, you could say, healthy news ecosystem in the next couple of years. And as it is by now heavily damaged, undermined, broke, and also somehow broken through various influences. Just to name a few, you all know the dominance of social media platforms driven by commercial interests. There's also the failure of most of the business models in news, or the lack of resilience in digital media consumption that can result in news avoidance or even a news burnout. There's also the negativity bias in the news and the unsensible reporting about climate change or the endless series of media scandals around the globe that undermines trust in media. And last not least, there's the endangered safety for journalists, including their own well-being. So even we all here on the panel have hopes that non-profit journalism could offer innovative solutions, at least in part, to these problems. Non-profit news can also be a little tricky sometimes, and that's what we're going to talk about this afternoon, about the perspectives and the concerns and challenges we have. So thank you all for joining us here and taking your time. The session is overwritten with the phrase, is journalism ready for charity? And this readiness is meant in 2 ways. The first one is, of course, are we all prepared for this? Are we, have the infrastructure and the legal structure and so on to get charity, to find donors? And the second one, of course, is it time now to give journalism charity? Are we that poor? Are we that neglected that we have to set our hopes on charity? So alongside with the biggest achievements so far, I want to discuss with my panel guests also the 4 major concerns to get into the discussion. And after 30 minutes or so, we would love to switch to a Q&A with you, the audience. And it's needless to say that if we're talking here about the concerns, it's not to militate against the non-profit sector, of course not. They rather represent potential challenges we want to discuss that non-profit organizations must deal with, to overcome and to ensure independent and high quality and sustainable reporting and organizing innovation. But we want to make sure clearing up the air a little bit, because there's also a lot of resistance out there against us who want to work and want a success in the non-profit sector. So first I wanted to start with the most widespread concern I heard of that almost always circulates when it comes to non-profit sector as we know it. And he has been an expert for years in this field, and that's why I would like to start our discussion with a question for Samir. You're working for leading organizations in journalism, philanthropy, media development, and human rights. So the first concern I would like to address to you is the dependence on donors of charity money. Whether it is super rich people, foundations, or tech companies, if we should explain to somebody who is not so much into the field, what would you say? Is donor money really endangering financial independence? And do you have a worst practice example and maybe also a best practice example you might refer to? What we can do about it? What can we do about this problem?
Yes, we're on. Before I attempt to answer that bouquet of questions, can I ask who in the room either runs or funds a non-profit media organization? Hands up.
Okay, these are friends.
So a lot of people with a lot of experience, you know, and so I think, you know, the Q&A I think will be a really rich one, I hope. And I think from my perspective, so I work a lot on how does the public interest journalism field get funded. I work with a variety of different stakeholders to think about that question all the time, and I think that comes in. You know, I've been a funder. I worked at Open Society for 4 years. I've worked with other funders, both to make grants and to help do strategies about how they think about this work. So this sort of thing comes up all the time, and I think what we have to do, from my perspective, is think about why are we thinking about this issue? Why do we need to fund bits of journalism, you know, at base? And it's partly, you know, there's a sort of industrial thing which everyone has been talking about and everyone talks about all the time, which is that the media industry, journalism, in some respects has been in turmoil. There's been a big transition around business models and everything else, and we don't need to retread all of that. But the key around this is that there are parts of the field, parts of the function of journalism and of public interest journalism particularly, that as that business model has changed and as the way in which media itself is funded and how it generates revenue and all of that stuff, as that shakes out, there are bits of journalism that it is less and less economic or attractive to do, and more people felt that they were left out, in a sense. That can range from investigative journalism to coverage of underreported communities or whatever it might be. And you know, in a very crude and simplistic way, the purpose of this funding and the purpose of the you know, funding public interest journalism, and particularly through mechanisms that, you know, are more focused on it, like independent media and so on, that's, in a way, it's a shift of that money, and it's much more visible to us now. And so that's, and this coincides with the interests of lots of philanthropic foundations or mission-oriented funders or whatever it might be. So I think at base, there's that to me is a sort of broad, it's, you know, it's not the most nuanced way of describing it, but I feel in the short time we have available, that describes a kind of big picture, soft focus idea of where that's coming from. You know, I think that there are lots of, you know, there are too numerous examples to kind of talk about, but I think that there is, broadly speaking within that, there are two ways of funding. One is in which you are funding because you intrinsically believe in the value and importance of media as an end in itself. You know, you fund with the idea of strengthening media, strengthening their independence, giving them the tools, the resources to be able to then go off and decide how they want to work and how they want to contribute to their society or city or issue area. And then there's a second way, which I think in some senses where some of the concerns often play out, which is where it's seen more instrumentally. You know, we're funding you because we want you to cover this topic. And I think, you know, we can talk some of, you know, and that's where, for example, some of the questions do arise around donor-driven reporting or undue influence. And some of them are overblown and some of them are valid. But I think that to me would be, if you wanted me to paint a sort of primary colors backdrop, that's what it feels like to me.
Okay, you really answered the question, but it's okay. We come back to the worst practice part. But I have another question for Elisa. It's a second concern that is very much related to the first one, because it's the influence of donors, the potential influences. And it means there's always a possibility that donors may have certain expectations, as you said just a second ago, of a non-profit news organization and their reporting, and they may seek to influence the journalistic direction, for example. So, Elisa, you are leading or co-leading together with Peter the Investigative Europe Association, this cross-border team around European countries. So the second question goes for you. Have you ever heard of a case where it has gotten south and ugly because a donor tried directly to influence some newsrooms reporting? And how would you recommend avoiding these major side effects if you had to?
Okay, you didn't ask me directly, like, have you ever been influenced by a donor? So I would, of course, reject.
I could have, but
yeah, you
I
could
put
have.
It more general.
Let's put it the no bullshit way, and I can say, no, we've never been influenced by our donors. There was never even an attempt. And I think that's I mean, also our job. I mean, we are investigative journalists. How is it if we take money from people on which we don't do due diligence? And if we just run for money, you know, without having any moral and ethical standards on this, then we could, like, you know, our job would be, ridiculous as such. So I think it's our responsibility to do due diligence on the foundations you approach or that approach you. And it's also our responsibility to diversify funding. We'll talk about this more, but the less stakes a singular foundation has in a portfolio of funders, the less the risk is that a singular could influence you. Then, of course, the dream funder of all of our organizations is the one that gives unconditional core funding. That's our job to lobby for, though of course project funding is also attractive to foundations for also good reasons, but not as attractive to us. So it's our job to make the case. And then of course we should still try to develop other revenue streams. I mean, we'll also talk about this later, that being a non-profit does not mean to have no ideas of a business model, but it also has to do with dependence. Now, the broader you spread, the less you are endangered by, you know, a certain influence of whatever kind. And I think going back to that, you could also say, I mean, about the influence of advertisers or politicians on you know, traditional legacy media. We're talking about this for decades, and it's no reason not to have any commercial media. So that's my take on that.
So do you remember an example where it has happened anyway, or?
I'm not talking badly about other organizations, because I don't know. Anywhere I was, I've not been influenced. There was no attempt. I hope others can speak up for themselves. And if they've been, well, I hope they're no longer around.
Okay. But we have also limited financial resources all the time. All the non-profits know that, right? So there's also a concern here. This can mean that non-profit journalism has fewer resources for research or for investigative reporting or elaborated journalistic projects. So that can definitely affect the impact or the quality of the journalism non-profits are doing. So I would like to address this potential challenge to you, Julia. You're both the managing director of Hostwriter, this global network, and the publishing platform Unbiased the News. Also, you have more than 15 years of experience in the NGO sector. How would you describe the limitation of money in the non-profit news sector, and what have you learned in the last 15 years about that?
I would like to maybe tie this a little bit back to the other question about the independence question, because I think in a sense it's also about how much money there is in total in the ecosystem. If there is a lot of money for journalism from all sorts of, like from commercial, from governments, from philanthropies, people will be less inclined to be desperate and to compromise their independence. So I think it's also a question of having the sector as a whole well-funded. In the non-profit sector, of course, I think there is, I would also say that core funding, unrestricted, would be the way to go. We've been really lucky with having Adesium, for example, that supported us for a long time with core funding, who really say they do not do thematic journalistic funding because they don't want to push different themes, and we would not take any funding that would tie into our editorial independence. However, I mean, we benefited greatly, for example, from winning the Google Impact Challenge, and I think Google has been a massive funder in the European media space, which I think we should be grateful for on one sense, but I think that's also a reason why I think, in a sense, there is also maybe less criticism against Google, I would say. So I think there should be a concern about having enough different sources of funding also, because it will impact sort of the whole landscape. I think it's also sort of wrong to think that, okay, because you're a commercial player, you are independent. I mean, there's also a reason why the MDIMF had this new initiative with blended funding to buy out media capture in Europe, because commercial interests also block the independence in several cases. So I think the most healthy ecosystem you will have when you have a lot of different sources of funding contributing to journalism. And one way to do that is also, for example, I worked previously for an organization that had both for-profit and non-profit set up. And I think then you can also sort of access both sides, or you can, as an outlet, for example, some of the investigations we do also get published in commercial outlets. So there are many ways to sort of collaborate in between non-profit and for-profit, and I think for the sector as a whole, more money makes it more resilient. I mean, for example, looking at places like Cameroon, we had an investigation in Cameroon where the system is absolutely broken. People are desperate. They have years of wages somewhere. Then, of course, you are very, very vulnerable to corruption. That's where we don't want to go. We want to have a very well-funded journalism to be able to really serve the public. So, and yeah, did I answer your question, or did I go somewhere else?
No, it's really, really great answer. May I ask, is there a difference between funding from tech companies, foundations, or individuals? What have you experienced?
I would say, like, tech companies in general have a lot of money. It's easy for them to give it out, and also quite unrestricted. So we could do a lot of things with a lot of independence with this money. But I think their strength was giving a lot of money out, and also targeting that it goes to everyone in the business, which is great for the whole ecosystem, but it also is amazing PR, of course. So, you know, there must be somebody who hasn't gotten it, who can be critical, right? Yeah. But also, we don't primarily work on criticizing tech. We primarily work to serve underserved communities. And for us, that has been amazing. Like, we couldn't do the work we did without having that support. So I think it's also about, you know, seeing that there is enough actors from each and every place, having funding from different sources so that everyone has somebody to control. Not that you have only government funding or only private donors or only tech funding, but that you have a mix so that journalism always can watch, somebody is watching somebody. Right?
Okay, so the mix would maybe do the trick. Aaron, we talked about it the other day. There's always a competition for funding, and it's growing. You know, the non-profit scene is growing, so is the competition. And that is also the concern of most people I know in the non-profit sector, because there are so many non-profit organizations by now competing for the limited, always same donations and foundations, it can be difficult to obtain sufficient financially support for a longer time, and especially for journalism activities. So you have just started a new project that is, as a cute name, Tiny News Collective, which I love, really, really cute name, that wants to help communities build newsrooms. So for doing so, you announced 2 years ago a commitment of $200,000 from the Google News Initiative to inaugurate the Tiny News Collective Launch Fund. So where do you stand today with this project? And I have to say, I find it really cool that you as a journalism professor are initiating such projects, really, really nice. How would you describe the competition 2 years ago and nowadays? What has changed?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I'm obviously American, you can tell that. In the US, we've had a long history of nonprofit journalism. National Public Radio goes back to the 1970s. Center for Investigative Reporting goes back about the same amount of time. The precursor of the Associated Press dates back to the 1800s. There are now, nonprofit news isn't an unusual thing anymore. In fact, you're starting to see a lot of for-profit organizations becoming nonprofit. The Salt Lake Tribune, for example, was a big commercial newspaper. They converted into a nonprofit the first time we've seen that. The Philadelphia Inquirer is owned by a nonprofit foundation, very much the Guardian style. Tiny News is meant to address the growing problem of news deserts, which is both well-known but also not nearly as well studied as it should be. The problem is far bigger than anyone realizes. Many of our founders are launching in communities that are allegedly not news deserts, like Cook County, which is where Chicago is, but communities that haven't had a news organization of any kind for years, and sometimes decades. And we're trying to build from the grassroots. We're trying to build from the bottom up and help small news organizations launch, grow, and then ultimately leave us. We want them to leave and become sustainable. And to be clear, not all of our founders are nonprofit. In fact, most are technically for-profit at this point, but the Tiny News Collective itself is nonprofit.
So you're providing a sort of infrastructure,
yeah,
and consulting, that kind of thing?
Yeah, it's kind of an incubator plus a community plus. But I would say that the biggest trend that we're starting to see in the nonprofit sector is actually competition from for-profits. The New York Times got $4.5 million to launch a reporting initiative. The Seattle Times has done a lot of work with the Gates Foundation. You're starting to see where there are pots of money, people aren't looking at their tax status, they're looking at the pot of money, right? And they're finding ways.
And they're grabbing for it.
And they're grabbing for it.
It's also in Germany the same case.
Yeah.
So what do you make out of it?
Oh, I hate it.
We got a double competition also in this field.
I hate it because we, in the nonprofit sector, I founded 4 nonprofits and worked in nonprofit news many times. So we can't go to investors, right, in the US. There's no such thing as equity in the nonprofit world. We can't go to a VC. We can't go get a traditional investment to fund our growth, to fund what we're doing. We only rely on philanthropy and individual donors. And I think it's sort of double dipping when you're competing with for-profits. Personally, I think it shouldn't be, to be honest.
So as an observer of the scene, what has changed in the, let's say, in the last 2 or 3 years?
Well, that, for one. But I think you're also seeing nonprofits grow to sizes that I didn't think we would ever see. We're seeing initiatives in Houston, like citywide, kind of trying to replace the either dying or, for all intents and purposes, already dead legacy newspaper. American Journalism Project is putting a lot of money into places like Cleveland and elsewhere to build sort of large metropolitan, well, the functional equivalent of a daily news a newspaper. And that, I think, is probably the most interesting trend on sort of a macro level. Yeah, I would say that's probably...
Would you estimate the money has, what, doubled, tripled in the last few years?
Yeah, it's hard to say.
I mean ProPublica was a kind of pioneer in the US, right?
For sure.
So it started when, 2008, maybe?
Yeah, roughly. And
yeah.
They've gotten massive now. They're doing local news. They said they were never going to do local news. Now they're doing local news. I think they're probably doing it mostly because someone has to, and they're in a position to do it. I don't know how big and I should, because I'm on a panel where that would be a very relevant thing to know. So next time we do this, I'll come with that information. But I don't know how much the money has grown. I would say there are definitely more and more foundations that haven't traditionally funded news are starting to come into this space.
So they have heard like the ringing the bell of the news desert and zombie newspapers and whatnot?
I'll tell you, news and information, now we're having a discussion about the intersection between news information and equity. It becomes an equity discussion. When the local paper, it costs $600 for a print subscription, and that's not a made-up number. And there's a paywall that gives you no access to news. And the digital subscription is over $200, which is now pretty much typical. If you're only serving people who can afford that, it becomes a real equity, a question of equity. And so I think that's why a lot of foundations are moving into this space. And I personally think that's the right thing. I'm glad for it. I'm very sad that some of the tech companies, one in particular, has decided to just abandon this space. That's very unfortunate. That was a very good source of funding for a lot of organizations.
Could you name it?
Sorry?
Could you name it?
Oh, come on, we all know what we're talking about. Yeah.
You do know who he means? Who doesn't know?
Meta is completely
Facebook,
abandoned.
Meta. Okay, we all know it. Yeah, and they also, stepped out of this Perugia's International Journalism Festival, as you might know. Yeah. Samir, we talked a lot about this boring legal stuff all the time. What do you think has to be done to foster, switching existing established legal newsrooms to switch into non-profit? Is that even attractive?
I mean, I think we should take them all by force and make them... No, I'm just... No. Just before we come on to that, I think... I think it's important to contextualize what you're saying, because what you're saying is you're coming from a very, like you say, a place where there's been a lot of rich history around non-profit journalism for a long time, comparatively. And it's not that there hasn't been non-profit journalism in the rest of the world, but that the tradition of and the complexities around funding it are not present in the same way. Yeah. And I think, for example, when you say foundations are moving into it, when I look at the things you describe, I've written about it as well, where I'll rather acidly kind of, I'll write about. I had to write journalism funders forum in Europe, write a newsletter. The initial brief was, can you tell us trends that are happening in European funding for journalism? And I'd do like 2 weeks of research. And I would go, and the first line would be, the purpose of this is to find trends in the European funding ecosystem for journalism. However, there aren't any. So here are some from the rest of the world. And it was, often we'd be stuck with what are interesting ideas that the Americans are doing and that, the very rich foundations in Europe could be thinking about doing. And really, honestly, they're not. And there's a core that are trying to do it, and many say they care about journalism, but really, honestly, there hasn't been a systematic push to do this and to even engage with it. And in many places, on a local level, I mean, in Italy, the foundations, ACRI, the banking foundations have they're sitting on enormous amounts of money, that some of which could serve public purpose in this respect, and it wouldn't be compromised through, it's not political, it's not compromising of independence. It's just that the conversation of how to do that properly has not been had. And that's true in many countries across Europe and in many countries around the world. So I just wanted to say that because it does keep me up at night. But I think on the legal environment and things like that, I think, again, you've got even within Europe, the legal situation is so different in different countries. There's no equivalence across the whole of Europe for non-profit media, cooperatives even. I mean, there's a little bit around cooperatives, charity law, and so on. So that makes it very costly and in some places risky to incorporate. You know, you can expose yourself to risks through this, through setting up as a charitable newsroom or a less as a non-profit maybe. And I think, you know, we have in Europe an opportunity to try and standardize, to harmonize across all these jurisdictions to make it easier where some governments are just a little bit reluctant to let that happen. I mean, outside of Europe, there are other places, you know, there are parts of the world where setting up as a charity or a non-profit media would immediately bring the eye of Sauron onto you. And no, really, and so people set up as other forms. And it's really not advisable. So, you know, this is not, nobody, I think one of the other things that, you know, the misconceptions I think that happen is that people think, well, if you're supporting non-profit media, you're saying that's a value judgment and we must all do more non-profit media. No, I think everyone believes that there should be a mixed economy of journalism and it should be produced in lots of different ways and as many different ways of reaching the public and serving the public in all its diversity as possible. But that you know, we need to make it legally possible where it is desirable to do so to enable people to set up in whatever form they want. And I think that's the thing where governments and, you know, have in some ways been dragging their feet. You know, the explosion that happened in the US around when the tax code was changed or however, you know, it really, you can see the increase in funding that went into this sector that then began to lead to the kinds of innovations and coalitions of funders and those sorts of things that have happened in the US. It's not happened elsewhere, really. I mean, little pockets. So, you know, that to me, you know, you have to look at, yes, what are media themselves doing, but the ecosystem and how it's organized and how what's even possible for people to do has to be changed to unlock that possibility even.
What do you think, Julia, about the comparison between countries? Is it easier somewhere, and is the infrastructure something else, maybe in Scandinavia compared to Southern Europe? What's your impression on that?
Yeah, I think media has a very different starting point in different places. I mean, that's clear. Like if you are working in Hungary, you have a very different setup than if you are working in Germany. If you're working inside of the European Union, you have a very different funding setup than in other places. But yeah, I mean, US has most of the philanthropic money. Like I think last thing I read was 90%. That was a while ago, but I don't know if it has changed. It's gone up. Oh my. So we should all move to the US. No, I think it's not a good idea. They have problems to solve, so it's okay. They can have a lot of money for it. But yeah, of course, there's different situations in different places. But I think one thing that I would like to point out with non-profit journalism is that I think it has kind of a potential to tackle problems in another way than for-profit media or public service media, because, I mean, especially working with diversity, I've also heard often from, for example, commercial media that they're scared of losing subscribers if they start to work towards more underserved communities, and they don't want to risk things to lose their normal paying subscribers. And they are always under this pressure to earn money, of course. And with the public service media, they're just huge organizations that takes forever to change. And looking at where journalism is now, with all these challenges that you previously mentioned, also with the sort of crisis of trust and AI, we need to tackle this somehow. And of course, as a kind of landscape or a community, I don't know how we are going to get there, but at least if you are in the non-profit sphere, you can find money somewhere to sort of target specific problems and sort of make your space to do that and experiment a little bit. And of course, there are issues with the non-profit journalism. You have to be careful not to become an octopus where you just have projects and no core funding. I mean, this is an issue. If you only have issues to tackle but nothing that actually holds your operations. But in a sense, it has that sort of dynamic where you can actually take a problem, focus on it, work on it, and have other impacts than just profit. So I think that's another function that it fills in the ecosystem.
I would love to open it for a Q&A, but I got the last question for Elisa here. Are we experiencing a kind of momentum right now? Because somebody who's attending here wrote me he's supervising a kind of wave of non-profit organizations just coming up, and there's a rise in non-profit at the moment. Do you have the same impression of this?
I think the need is very obvious. No? So the need for new innovative projects that are very often coming from the non-profit scene, because these are people that like to take risks and try to new things. But I don't think it's especially encouraged, to be fair. So as we were saying, a lot of the...
By whom? Sorry, by whom encouraged?
Well, I'd say by those who are able to provide the funding. I mean, we were talking about structural funding that is also coming from the EU now in big waves, and you can often see this is going to legacy media. I mean, one of my examples that I like to quote is a group of news agencies that get now a lot of money in Brussels to have a common bureau, where I'm thinking they're fully paid, they could sit together easily. Why do they need so much money to do that while they have big money in their back? And for example, because you were talking about the legal situation, on the one hand side, for us, for example, being a charitable, cooperative, European cooperative, but based in Germany, we have an advantage towards other countries because there is a lot of money in Germany, and it's easier on the small donor base to activate people to support this kind of journalism. But there is no charity status for journalism in Germany, which makes this all a very risky undertaking, and which is also holding the scene very, very small in Germany. So we both know the scene, and you can count the successful examples, I'd say, with two hands. And all of them have to come up with purposes, which is not doing journalism. You have to be an educational center. You have to, do workshops. You have to be a customer protection thing. In our case, it was easier because we have the purpose of understanding of peoples, which is, when you're coming from many countries, an easier thing to prove. For a local initiative in Germany, there is basically zero reason they can find in this tax law, which is such an administrative thing, to base their charitable status on. And what consequences does that have? A lot of foundations have the charity status as their as one of the criteria you have to have. So that's one thing. The other thing is that charity status is a signal of trustworthiness, also for the average person, and also you can get the tax refund. So it's a big motivation. I mean, it's nothing but about giving people their money back if they invested in good things. And then, if you look at the German foundation scene, for example, I mean, you've quoted a number. We have about 23,000 foundations in Germany with $1 billion in capital, and I think you said like 95% of them are, and somehow with some charitable investment for the public good, but there's less than 1% of this going in journalism, and I think we would unleash a huge potential. And you can see it like in the number of new organizations that are coming from the Netherlands. That's no coincidence. Yes, the Netherlands are a rich country, but also they have this kind of infrastructure for centers to grow. And I think Germany could be one of those, but if we ever reach this, I don't know. There is some political willingness to do so, but as you say, we also have to start convincing our own peers, other media. That's something which I hope we'll succeed, but there's no certainty in these things. And I don't think all our society is moving towards more progressive approaches as much as I would like to be an optimist about this. Otherwise, there wouldn't be such need for organizations like ours.
Quick comment from you, Samir, and then we open to you.
Yes. One, I think that's a brilliant summation, so thank you. I think to add on to that, it's not just that we're talking about non-profit or charitable media. I think we're all, to me, this sits within a broader wave. The wave that you're talking about, I think, comes from independence. I think there's a real wave around independent media happening at the very local level, up through the chain, and people have been trying to build new independent media. Some of them are for-profit, some of them are, other models, cooperative, et cetera, et cetera. Within that, there's a specific, as you say, there's a particular channel and line around charitable law, tax codes, and so on that unlocks a particular source of funding that is like blocked to journalism without that status. But more broadly, you can see that there are lots of people who essentially work. I mean, I don't know, how, and maybe we'll come to this when we, you know, with the Q&A. But you know, of the people here, how many of you are making an enormous profit? You know, so it's not that journalism is, if it's non-profit, you're all out there Rockefellering everyone, right? So you know, you're doing it because it's mission-driven, because you care about your communities. Often you take a second job, a third job. You're overworking. In some senses, you're subsidizing communities, or you know, with the quality journalism and the information you're producing. You know, that's rarely quantified as something that's a contribution to the journalistic ecosystem, to local democracy, to local communities, the local economy. You know, so I think that's something that is a really important thing to pay attention to.
Okay, Rockefeller, that's a really nice term.
Broader independent media landscape, which itself is not, you know, not focused on generating returns for itself, but to drive back into journalism and into communities anyway.
So I can see two questions here. First, it's you, and thank you.
Thank you so much. Hello.
We
Thank you so much. My name is Ricardo. I'm a journalist and co-founder of Fumaça, an investigative journalism podcast out of Portugal. We started in 2016 as a group of volunteers, and then in 2018 we managed to become professional with a goal of becoming sustainable by a membership program, a non-transactional membership program where people give a monthly recurring donation while we are still remaining non-profit and our journalism open to everyone without paywalls. And in 2018, we had 0 people in this program. Today, we managed to reach 1,900 people, which means for the first time, more than half of our budget comes from membership, 55%. And the reason why we actually got here is because really Open Society Foundations gave us a few different grants, a total of around 500K around in the last few years. But as you probably all know, officially or unofficially, the journalism program of the Open Society has ended, which also meant that a lot of the projects who were backed by the OSF now are left with very few alternatives. Also because in the meantime, there's a trend, or there seems to be happening a trend where foundations like Luminate and Adesium and the International Fund for Public Interest Media, they all don't give money to at least Western Europe, and rather ironically, Portugal is Western Europe. And so my mission being here in Perugia for the second time is, other than being inspired by the work of my colleagues are doing, and also going to some aperitif and some dancing, is also trying to convince funders that they should also consider the south of Europe as part of their list when they decide where to give money. But I've been very unsuccessful in that. When I tell funders that they should consider that, they all say, with very valid reasons, that there are other regions and other countries that are even more underprivileged than us. But this obviously then creates a fundraising limbo, where Portugal is not rich enough to have philanthropy and national foundations, but it's also not poor enough, or doesn't have an authoritarian enough regime to have funders consider us a country that should receive money. So I wanted to get your ideas on how to tackle this problem, or how to rather convince other people to tackle this problem, and that's my question.
It's a really good question. Who wants to answer? So you, maybe Samir?
I mean, if only there were a really enormous foundation called Gulbenkian in Portugal that had enormous amounts of money that it dispenses in lots of other areas, but not, I mean, it's done small amounts in journalism, but I think there's a lot of room for growth, let's say. Oh, has it stopped? Oh, sorry, I apologize. Okay, so they briefly experimented, but I think it would be good to see Gulbenkian come back to the table. And I'm sure there are other routes. I mean, you know, there are 2 other places where Portugal is that I know. You know, Civitates has, you know, within its purview, Portugal, but it's not a huge fund. And then the Active Citizens Fund, which is the EEA Norway grants, has got some funding. But you're right, there are a number of countries across that band of Europe that have very little, and domestic philanthropy is really not at the races. You know,
Here's another idea from Elisa.
I think it's what you're already doing. No, I think our only chance then is to build gangs and to fundraise, like as this field of smallish non-profits and independent ones. I know then definition becomes also challenging at a certain point, but like go for structural funding that is shared, for example. Now can be overhead sharing, can be organizational sharing, so that the little or not so little money that you are otherwise able to either fundraise or get from supporters is really going only and directly to your journalism, and the other needs are taken care of in some kind of a collective effort. If the others don't help us, we have to do it ourselves.
Okay, great. That's exactly what the Tiny News Collective is meant to be. We spend a lot of time in conferences like this talking about revenue. Where's the money? Where's the money? We almost never talk about ways to reduce cost. And every dollar, euro you reduce on this side makes this side less of a hurdle. I completely agree. I think collective action, shared services is an essential step.
Okay, here's another question from this young man.
My name is Philipp Kramer. I'm from Switzerland and the co-founder of the European Correspondent. I'm from a country that has a lot of money. I would be happy to give some to Portugal and Hungary. We're the land of foundations. But even in Switzerland, where you see a lot of experiments, there is big doubt if how to scale non-profit media outlets. So I was a campaigner before that, and they don't have the political power that they can really bring a story that shakes the state up. And my question is, what do you see as, are there any good examples where this already worked? And what are tactics to scale non-profit media outlets?
Very good question. What you do want to address it to? Maybe Julia? No?
I'd like to know.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, for me, the most extraordinary example is from Germany, the Forum Gemeinnütziger Journalismus, which, you know, you know better than I.
Yeah, we three are members of the Forum für Gemeinnütziger Journalismus, and that's the whole idea. You know, we bring together a network of people and organizations who are going to lobby for this, who are going to fight for this, who are going to maybe fund money for this in a while, in the future.
Another European example is Reference. It's this circle of smaller independent organizations. It's also a lot of them are in this room of the founding members. But this whole idea is that there is an exchange of how to, do the non-journalistic part of the work, and I mean how to grow as an organization. So. Because you start as a very intrinsic, motivated team, and then you might be more successful than you ever thought, and then you get a bit more money, and then you hire more people, but there's no real, business plan behind it in many of the cases if it's founded by journalists. And I think this is a very different attempt than when people were, thinking of new magazines because they were so nicely to build around advertisement for home furniture, and then you come up with nice articles to make them look good. That's a very different a mindset from the start. So I think there are now a growing infrastructure that helps lobbying to political and to infrastructure authorities and foundations to really give a voice to those who are not yet as big players as they could be. But you can also see that, for example, in Germany we have Correctiv, which is around for a long time, that has inspired many others. But you can still see that also they are facing a lot of struggles because they are pioneers, as all of us are in certain. But for example, they've grown. I'd say massively on the scales we are talking about.
And even in Switzerland, there's a new project, a platform called We Publish. It has an umbrella for local blogs who are non-profit and local newsrooms, and this is great. I think even you in Switzerland are thinking about it.
Yes, I can say from my experience that they don't get the scale and the power, and I don't see a sign that happening soon. My question is more precisely, I was asked if if we are a for-profit, we could have chances to get like a marketing budget of 20 million to reach people in Europe. And we're a non-profit, and I find it correct that we're a non-profit, but are there non-profit media outlets that can get the same amount of money and run the same amount of marketing campaigns? And
I'm curious why tax status would get you $20,000 marketing budget.
These were investors that wanted.
We have. I got the sign from behind. We have to close the session. Thank you so much for your questions. We are still here for a couple of minutes, so we would welcome you to give us your questions after the session. Thank you very much all for coming and listening. Thank you for your time. Thank you.